you do feel revolting. You do feel that you're probably hideous to touch. You do feel that you're scarred or tainted. And how could she possibly look at someone like me again in the same way, knowing that that had happened to me?
Welcome back to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that aims to guide you towards a more resilient life and whatever it might throw at you. If this is your first time with us, then do please hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. It really does help make sure these, I hope, useful conversations are shared as widely as possible. Today I'm joined by David Tate, someone who the novelist Tom Wolfe would have described at one point in his career as a king of the world, a banker who through skill and a love of risk made his fortune as a city trader. David, who is now the CEO of the World Gold Council, is also an accomplished mountaineer, having climbed Everest an astonishing 5 times and in the process raised over £8 million for charity. So on the face of it, David has led a somewhat charmed life, but nothing could be further from the truth. And in explaining that, I have to say this will be one of the most difficult, but I think you'll agree with me at the end, inspiring conversations that we've had on this podcast. The clue to this story lies in the beneficiary of David's incredible fundraising, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC. For David, at the age of 10, was the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of his grandfather's brother and 3 other men. He was also abused by his own father. David, like so many who suffer this horror, kept his abuse secret. Doing so, he believes, allowed him to build that successful city life, but at a terrible price that ultimately led to the most visceral of crises, not just for him, but for those he loved. So our guest today, whose story is told in the moving 2020 film Sulphur and White, I think you're going to agree, is the absolute epitome of resilience and also of bravery. David, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
How are you?
Very good, thanks. A bit jet-lagged, but pretty good.
Good. Thanks for joining us. You know the purpose of this podcast, the reason we created it 4 years ago, is to share the stories of those who've survived crisis. So before we start, I just wanted to say, having watched it recently, your film Sulphur and White, it is a very difficult watch, but it's also a very, I think, important piece of filmmaking, and is quite possibly the most courageous piece of crisis storytelling, if I can put it that way, that I've ever witnessed. It's astonishing for a number of reasons, not least the brutally honest way in which you are portrayed, and also I think for its absolute total absence of self-pity, despite the horrors that you endured as a boy. I think I'm right in saying that you were very clear that that's the way you wanted that story to be told. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. And mind you, it went through various iterations. It started by me trying to write a book back in 2007 when I was a bit broken after my 2007 climb. I just decided to write everything down, having just before that climb told the world that I was one of those children in my NSPCC begging emails for sponsorship. So when I got back, and I had 3 months off because I was literally physically broken, and I wrote down this story of 7 chapters of climbing and 7 chapters of idiosyncratic stories from my past that interwove. And I thought that when you get to the summit, you get to the story and the explanation as to why I've done all this. And so I thought that was genius. And I handed it to book agents who thought it was incredibly boring. Could I please get rid of all the climbing stuff? It was the climbing they thought was boring. But if I could come back with 14 or 15 chapters of personal stories, they'd be interested. And in a fit of hubris, I slung this manuscript in a drawer. My wife handed it to a chap who liked to make movies, and eventually we ended up doing it, as you know.
There are one or two things in the film that were changed, locations. You know, what happened to you, which we'll get onto in a moment. In the film, takes place in South Africa. In fact, it took place in London. There are some other minor details, but essentially it is your story.
Absolutely.
And it is, as I said earlier, brutally honest about the impact of, you know, your story on you, and as importantly others, as your life sort of moved forward, carrying this terrible secret. The film, I should say, by the way, amazing cast: Anna Friel, Mark Stanley, Emily Beecham, had a royal premiere, and should have had a much wider audience, but COVID got in the way. I mean, having poured so much into it, the import of this thing for you to finally tell the full story in the way that it does, that must have been so difficult for you.
Yeah, it was. You know, we had 5 or 6 weeks shooting in London, which was a dream for me, and then 2 weeks in South Africa, where Anna Friel and Dougray Scott sort of recreated my childhood in front of my eyes, which was the most amazing 2 weeks of my life, horrific and wonderful all in one. And then literally the most terrifying day of my life was the premiere, and I stood outside the cinema watching people gather, and I felt faint. And yet the evening, watching Her Royal Highness pull up in the car, get out, lights flashing, was quite an incredible moment for me. She actually held my hand through the whole of the film, by the way. Quite amazing.
Astonishing.
But yes, 2 weeks later, I was presenting in the Everyman Liverpool as a precursor to the film. I tried to travel around all the Everymans to do it. It was exhausting. And I got a text, or Sky News announced Boris had closed all the cinemas. And that was that. It was extremely difficult. And
But not just in terms of, okay, this thing is not going to get the audience that it deserves. But your motive was not, it's not a commercial motive that sat behind this film. The motive could not have been more significant for you personally, but also, you know, more broadly, your mission, in essence, which continues to be your mission, was to tell a story in the hope that it would give others who perhaps are enduring the same agonies in their life to have, you know, to see that it doesn't have to mean the end of their life. It doesn't have to mean, you know, a total unraveling of their worlds.
That's right. The intention is to try not only help survivors, not sure I quite like that phrase, but survivors, but also their families, who frankly might not even be aware of the fact they've got someone in their midst who has been touched in this way. But yes, I wanted it to be used as an encyclopedia for people in the world, do the charity some good. The proceeds, my proceeds, had there been any, would have gone to the charity, and they still will. But deep down inside me, I'd reached a point towards the culmination of the making of the film where I thought I was going to be able to declare victory. I had these faces in my mind, which I still have in my mind, when I wake up every morning and cross my mind during the course of the day.
Can I just stop you there? Every day?
Yeah, every day. You learn to manage it, but they're always there. Always there. And I defy anybody to say that's not the case. And I actually confessed to Vanessa that I felt they'd won when the cinemas were closed and when the film didn't do well. I thought I was going to be able to turn around in my mind and I suppose give the middle finger to the 4 or 5 faces I have in my mind, that I won in the end. I managed to turn that story, what you did to me, into a force for good. See? Right at my age, that was what I was saying to myself, and that's why I was driven so hard. It was the hardest thing to get across the line. And then to be robbed by a once-in-a-century event, I almost had them all laughing at me in my head. And that sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? but I couldn't. Had to get the pictures out of my mind of them all chuckling. You didn't in the end, and that's the way I felt about it for about a year. And coming up to 1 year anniversary of the release of the film, it was a pretty tough time. I even revisited
And now?
Beachy Head.
Did you really?
Oh, I went down there. And there was a tragic month of January that was January 21.
I should explain that Beachy Head is a significant location in this story, and we'll move on to it later. What you're telling me is that much later, post the release of this film, that you went back there. Did you go back there?
No, I wasn't. It was just almost cathartic in a peculiar way.
Yeah.
I had no intention. I wasn't that depressed, but it felt like, what have I got to do? You know, it's a bit of worries me, a bit self-pity, I'll be honest. But I used to take, it was mid-COVID, you know, I was depressed anyway. You drive down there, I just sit there and think, my God, 30 years ago, or 25, 30 years ago, this is where I started this whole thing. And now I've had it ripped away out of my hands, very woe is me, as I say, by COVID, of all things.
I don't think it's woe is me, David. I think that is,
Oh,
if you
it was
don't
tough,
mind me
though.
saying,
It was
I mean,
tough.
it's the...
Couldn't quite believe it.
Yeah. Look, let's talk more about what came sort of post the release of the film. But if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the beginning, so our listeners and viewers have the full context here. You were born in the UK. You moved as with your family as a baby to South Africa for a while. And as I say, that features heavily in the film, but in truth you came back to South London, to Deptford, when you were 10 with your mum and dad. Do you remember those early years there? Have you got many memories sort of pre what we're about to come on to discuss?
Yeah. Warm, swimming, warm brown skin, having fun. Mornings at school, come home at 1 o'clock because it was hot. Barefoot, playing, you know, adventures. Always swimming. They're wonderful memories of South Africa.
You came back to London, David, presumably excited about your new life.
Yes, it was surreal. We came back on the Edinburgh Castle liner. Just got film of that as well. And we docked at Southampton. I looked down to see my grandparents for the first time that I could really remember. And we moved into that house in Deptford, Victorian house on Evelyn Street. And the traffic thundering past, the whole front room used to move.
As I understand it, David, you're given a job working for your grandfather's brother in what is the cafe in Deptford Park. Can you tell us what happened, please?
Yeah. I got a little job. It was, I think it was just £1 a week at the time, which was quite a lot of money. I was asked to wash up and sweep and most notably stack the shelves, little shelves of sweets. It was one of those shops with the Lion's Mate swinging board outside it and some wrought iron chairs. And I'd fallen in love with Fry's chocolate cream, chocolate bar. In Africa we didn't have sweets, funny enough. We had fruit and little packets of raisins and stuff, but I fall in love with the stuff. And the chocolate came in flimsy cardboard boxes. And one day I dropped a box of this Fry's chocolate cream when I was stacking the shelves, and it broke open. And as I scooped down to pick them up, I slipped a bar of the chocolate cream in the waistband of my shorts. I stole a bar. The owner had seen me do it. I hadn't seen him come up behind me. Ordered me to put it back, and as I turned to do that, I was hit from the back of my head on the side of my right hand. And I went flying. I hit the shelving, and I fell onto the ground. And then I remember my t-shirt get ripped up, and my shorts were ripped off, and I was wearing sandals, and I remember the buckles scraping on the concrete, and then on the floor I was raped by this man. To be honest, at that moment I didn't know what it was. I had no idea what had happened, to be perfectly frank. All I know that it was screamed like hell, hurt a lot. as I say in my NSBCC speech, I wasn't allowed home too much later. I was told to clean myself in a small toilet cubicle and bandage myself with toilet paper. There were what do they call them? Air fresheners, which smelt of lavender, so strong in the toilet that I can't smell lavender without getting a proper horrible feeling now. And I wasn't allowed home. He continued during the course of the day, and eventually when I was told to go home, it was with my father, who was a strict disciplinarian, used to cane me, being told that I was a thief, ringing in my ears, that stopped me telling anybody. I was more scared of that, because Frank, I didn't really know what had happened.
Of course.
Yeah, I didn't really know. There was no stigma at that point. You knew it was wrong, but you didn't know what was wrong. And I kept going back to the shop. I had to, because I couldn't tell anyone. Over the course of, I've been asked how long. I think it was about 4 months. It was a hot summer. And then one day, I saw my father walking towards the store. He used to have this greenish tweed suit. And that day, I was, again, him and his friends, not my father, but the shop owner's friend showed up. And that day, I wore a hood. First time.
They put a hood on you?
Yeah, that day. And peculiarly, the same day I saw my father walking in the park, at least. It seemed to be coming towards. I remember looking out this wire mesh door. And to this day, I don't know for certain that my father was in that store with them. But the wearing of the hood was erratic. And so I always wondered, literally quite wondered. And then eventually my parents found us a home in Sanderstead in Croydon, near Croydon, and we moved away. But that following Christmas, very soon after the time we left, we went back to my grandparents' house, as we nearly always did at Christmas. And their house was closed off above level 2 of, I think, nearly 6 levels to conserve heat. And my sister and I used to play in this room, and we used to play Thunderbirds. And that man managed to catch me upstairs on Christmas, on Boxing Day. And to this day, I have a aversion to Christmas, which I've got to be honest, sounds childish, but I do, and I tend to try and take myself away from my family at Christmas. And then ultimately, my father started to visit me in Sanderstead, and it was not of the same nature that of the shop abuse, but it was similar. And he was discovered by my mother, who walked into my bedroom. And I still remember the silhouette of her standing there in the doorway. And exactly as portrayed by Anna in the film. And then turning on her heels and walking away. And then everything ended.
The first thing I want to say is just how sorry I am.
For what happened.
It may be a long time ago, David, but I'm just so sorry that you had to endure that. And I'm sure anyone who's listening to this or watching this would want me to say the same.
Thank you.
There are obviously, a whole range of kind of issues that emerge from that. The first, I suppose, is, the film suggests this, that your father was somehow complicit.
It suggests
that.
Like I said, I was trying to be specific. I didn't know for certain.
Your recollection is you're not clear. You know he was in the vicinity on one of the occasions when you were abused by.
And I've always extrapolated that.
By both your grandfather's brother and 3 other men, I think I'm right in saying. But the fact that he abused you himself much later suggests to you that may well have been the case. But let's be clear, you don't know.
Exactly.
When your mother discovers him in your bedroom, you say she turns on her heels and leaves the room. What happens at that point? As I understand it, she moves the 2 of you into a different part of the house. You're kept separate from your father, but you remain in the house. Yeah,
she remains in the house. She moves downstairs into the dining room. In a slightly later stage, I end up down there with her. There was no interaction between them She couldn't go anywhere though at first. He was a sort of parent, father who comes home and left cash on the working top, so she couldn't actually leave the house. She had nowhere to go. Luckily,
you have a sister who's younger than you.
Yeah,
obviously unaware of everything that's going on.
That's right.
Yeah,
but she remembers my mother moving downstairs and all that, and then eventually she has the luck of discovering someone, moves out of the house. By that point,
another relationship.
Yes, yeah. another relationship. At that point, we continued to live in the house. I grew significantly bigger than my father. There was never any abuse from that moment when she came into that room. It all stopped, but their relationship ended in that moment.
No physical abuse, but his mere presence.
Oh, it was torture.
It's abuse of a kind, right?
It was difficult. I mean, he was the one who, silly things really, that heating was always off and I would always turn it up, and the phone had a lock on it, dial phones, and it was an experience, to say the least, and it, with the benefit of hindsight, it's true, it makes you the person you are. You know what you're capable of, what you're capable of enduring. And then jumping forward a little bit, I got a job, and my girlfriend at the time turned around to me one evening and said, "It's Friday evening, would you like to come to my mother's birthday party?" And I just got home from work, him and I in the house. I was lying on the couch in the dark in my one suit with my one shirt and my tie with my kitchen medals all over it. Horrible. And I said, "Yes, I'll come." And this 560 SEL Mercedes pulled up outside. The contrast between getting into that car and smelling my future mother-in-law's perfume and the beauty of that car and where I was transformational in my mind. And I remember driving towards this pub, and I looked down, and there was a little light on the armrest. And I reached down, I pressed it, and the window went down. And it was such an amazing moment for me. And the contrast between where I was only an hour before to suddenly where I was, it was like going to heaven. And I resolved in that moment that I was going to have one of those cars. That was it. And so what I'm trying to say by that story is that there are pivotal moments where you can take the horrors and make them an incredible motivation. And it almost becomes a superpower.
Yes.
One of the things I mentioned to a lady the other day who came into my office to discuss her problems was how we both see it deep down inside as almost a bizarre superpower, because you've been to the worst place and nothing on God's earth is going to be worse than that. And so you're far more adventurous. You take chances, and that's what I found when I moved to Goldman Sachs.
At what age were you able to kind of begin to understand what had happened to you? I'm not saying, kind of work it out in any meaningful way, but just sort of understand what happened to you. Because I'm assuming, and I may well be wrong, that at that point came a tremendous amount of anger as well.
Absolutely. It wasn't that far afterwards when I started understanding quite 10, 11, 12, you're going into those formative puberty years. By the time I was 12, 13, going to secondary school, I knew full well what had happened to me. I absolutely understood it. I don't remember. I remember visiting the library. I remember reading. I remember finding magazines. I figured it out. And then I really worried, which might sound an offensive thing to say, but I worried about my sexuality. I worried what had happened to me, what had it made me. I don't want that to sound negative.
No,
but
you're young.
As a child, I was scared of that. I was scared of it. And I had no one to tell. And the little jokes the kids used to make on the bus grievously affected me when they'd use, I remember back in the day, kids used to use homo and things like that.
Yeah.
As a 12 to 13-year-old kid, having been through what I'd gone through, I was like in turmoil. And I'd go out of my way to prove that I wasn't. And this was a trait through my early years of just consuming relationships as fast as I could to convince myself effectively that I was normal as I saw it, put it that way.
You never talked about it with your mother?
No. No, absolutely not. No, it would have. My mother never knew about the shop.
Right.
My mother only ever knew about my father.
Right.
I saw no benefit, although it was tempting at times to bring it up. I didn't tell her about anything past.
Do you wish you had now?
No, it was the right decision. She dealt with enough, and it made her very ill, and that was a horrible time, and I regret the manner in which I dealt with her. In a way, I regret the manner in which I peculiarly dealt with my father. I wasn't very mature. I can explain it all away, but with the benefit of hindsight, I wish I hadn't treated her the way I did.
Obviously, you were a bright boy. Your skills at school, I'm sure, were obvious to some, or not. I don't know. I'm interested to know the transition from the story that we've just heard. I think your first job in the city was with Lloyd's, I think I'm right.
It was,
yeah.
So I applied to 4 banks, and I got a job at Lloyd's Bank International, as it was at the time, because I knew there were dealing rooms, and I knew dealing rooms from my father's time of trading, looking after gold in South Africa. And gold is pure coincidence that I've come back to it. And yes, I got into the dealing room. I was very driven, very axed to do that. Route 1, very brutal. Got there. I excelled. I was lucky. I never lost money for 18 months or something on any day. There were small amounts in those days, but it was quite a record. Goldman Sachs gave me a call, and I didn't even know who they were.
Was it like David? Because in the film, we're drawn to the conclusion that what had happened to you as a child had sort of created a characteristic in you, if you like.
It's true.
That was, you were the very opposite of risk averse.
That's exactly right.
You didn't care really about the consequences of the work that you were doing, and that made you, in many ways, a very, very effective trader.
Looking back on it, you're absolutely right. If I have to look back and re-examine it, as I've done with other people, my superpower was the fact that I literally, at that point when I walked into Goldman Sachs, in fact when I walked into Lloyd's, I didn't care. And that's not bravery. I wasn't a brave person, brave trader. There's a difference. I didn't care. I didn't care about myself. And that gave me an edge.
There's a line in the film where you say, money can't hurt you.
No, it can't. It was like, that's exactly right. Susie Farrell managed to grasp that. There was no way I was going to be intimidated by numbers. If, having been where I'd been, fire me, I don't care. I just became, frankly, and people will always say to me, God, you're so Route 1. And that's true. And it comes with its advantages and disadvantages. I have a big team mopping up around me as I do my Route 1 stuff, the collateral damage. And that's, ironically, why the film was made, to demonstrate this collateral damage.
Yes.
And that was my intention, not to demonstrate what sexual abuse is, although I think Julian Gerald did a wonderful job.
He did, incredibly sensitive. Yeah.
But it was to show the collateral damage. And I still have a tendency to do. I'm better now, because my whack-a-mole wife, Vanessa, has a way of managing me.
We will talk about Vanessa. Before we do that, let's talk about, because it is 2 tracks, isn't it? You've explained the superpower, but it is also, if you don't mind me using the clunky kind of analogy, it is also your kryptonite, because running alongside that, of course, is as I think in the film you describe it as an emptiness, which is also causing untold damage to you and to others. But let's just fill in a few of the details so people have the context. You married very young. That young lady that you mentioned at 21, you had 2 children quite quickly. There's a scene in the film, David, where you're talking much later to your father. You have lunch with him, with your lady who's to become your second wife. And he criticises you for having left your 2 older children, or not having spent enough time with them. That meeting happened, didn't it? The conversation is real, because he he criticises your parenting skills, which is, to say an affront, would be a massive understatement. But you never confronted him directly over what he did to you?
No, I didn't. There was only that meeting. There was one meeting where I wanted to experiment. It was exactly 10 years to the day. After I left the house in Sandsted when I walked out.
We should explain, in the intervening period, you cut yourself off from both your mother and your father.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
My mother for about 5 years, during which time she got ill, and my father for 10 years. And then I had this sudden impulse life was changing. I'd got a bit older. I'd been quite successful, and I wanted to show off. I wanted to sort of say, as I remember it, you see, you didn't get me.
And he says to you, you're the same as me, but in a better suit. He said that to you? Can I ask why you didn't confront him? Having now explained that you'd joined the dots, you knew what had happened to you. Yes, you'd kind of turned that into, as you say, a superpower. But you also got this void in your life that's a direct consequence of what happened to you. You didn't want to confront him?
Not in detail, because at the time I didn't have the confidence to humiliate myself again. I didn't want to go into detail and describe what had happened. And that was captured by Susie in the manner in which Mark Stanley talks to Dougray. You leave them alone, don't you, Dad? It was more a conversation that skirted around the edges. I wanted to see how I feel being in the same room, talking to the same person. And in a somewhat perverse way to some, I also felt like I was missing a father. You know, I was very loner. I was very much a lone person. And I'd really wished I'd had someone to talk to. A lesson for me with my own children. But
you still wanted your dad?
I know it sounds ridiculous, but
no,
I did.
It doesn't at all.
I felt that if I could just have someone I could talk to who could give me some advice. I got married too young. I hadn't asked any silly questions. I'd done okay, but I still had that missing bit. And I thought, I'll try. And it was pure impulse, and I did it, and it didn't work. And it wasn't going to work. I just knew in that moment. We moved on, and eventually he died.
He died in 2002, I think.
I believe, yeah.
And as far as you know, David, your abusers were all dead some time before.
Yeah, I was in my early teens. I remember my mother telling me my grandparents died. Everybody, I don't know the other people, but my grandparents' brother died. I remember being told that when I was 12 or 13 years old.
But as far as you know, none of them faced justice, because the chances are, we don't know, they abused others.
Yeah, there is that chance.
And you don't know whether or not there are any consequences for that at any point for any of them.
No. I'm grateful that they died then, because if I'd grown up a little bit older, by 16 I was good, strapping 6'2", 6'3", I would have gone back. And that would have been a disaster for my life. When looking back, I doubt I would have been given much license by the authorities. I think it would have changed everything. Because
you're certain that you would have done that?
I'm absolutely certain I would have done that. Yeah. The same way I'm certain that if someone touched my son or daughter, they wouldn't see tomorrow's sunrise. So I'm certain, but I'm also grateful that nature took its own course, and that gave me an opportunity to have a life.
Your mum, as you say, became very ill. again in the film, this point about brutal honesty about your own kind of relationship with her. It's the film makes kind of portrays you in a way that is pretty harsh against her. Tell me about that. Tell me what happened with your mother.
We never really discussed what she saw my father doing, or me doing, I should say. But finally, there was a period, it's a ridiculous thing I did. When I was 18, 19, in a fit of anger, I kicked the front door of my father's house. Long story. And the door literally fell off its hinges. It was quite amazing, like a comic scene, really. And I stood and stared at it for a minute, then propped it up and went out. My father, when he came home, threw me out the house. Don't come back. And he was right. Taken in isolation, his reaction to it, not throwing me out, but his reaction to it was correct. I did something really stupid, infantile. My mother, in a conversation on the phone, backed him. And in my mind was the ultimate betrayal about something so ridiculously trivial.
No, but it spoke to a wider betrayal.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounded like, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
And being young, childish, emotionally immature, I put the phone down and didn't speak to her for what was nearly 5 years. I regret that enormously. In the dealing room, we used to have these phones, which I think was depicted by Mark, with buttons on them.
Yeah.
That could close the mouthpiece off. And my mother would continually call the dealing room, and people would continually put her through to me. She'd never stop. And people knew around me that I was being callous, but I had this Route 1 approach.
And they also had no idea what sat behind it.
No. And so she'd sit on the phone open for hours. Anyway, long story short, she got ill as a consequence. And that ultimately led to her ending her own life in her own way. It was horrific, really, the way she did it. She starved herself to death.
You are certain that her decision was essentially guilt-driven, and that she...
Her getting ill definitely came at a time during those 5 years of persecution. Now, you could argue, I don't have proof. No, of course I don't. But was it that period? Did she recover from that? No. And the guilt that she suffered, I think, through virtue of my father, led ultimately to a point where, when I cleaned out her house after she died, I found on the bedside table a booking with the local undertakers, and again, funnily enough, in Deptford, and a quote for £1,250 for her funeral, and £1,249 quote, and £1,250 was all was left in her account. So
that tells you it was intentional.
It was intentional. She locked the door, had to break the door down, and it was all that. Horrible.
I think a lot of people listening to this would say that it is brutal honesty, David. But it is, and I hesitate to say this, but it is an unbelievably complex situation. And there were 3 people in truth, caught in that unbelievably complex situation, and that your decision to cut off is on a number of levels understandable. You cut yourself off from your parents in the way that we've described. You know, you're essentially pushing the past down, if I can describe it that way. I hope that's kind of accurate. You've developed this Route 1 drive, determination to succeed. You are succeeding. You're making money. Explain your, aside from your parents in the way that we've discussed, describe your sort of state of mind at this stage, because again, the film is so brutally kind of critical of you and your behaviour in the film. Again, accurate.
Yeah. My time at Goldman in those years was dominated by working, trying to make as much money as possible, a single-minded approach to accumulating relationships, euphemism for playing the field as fast and as aggressively as I possibly could. But, and this is an important bit, not for sexual conquest. If I could differentiate, clearly it came as a package, but I was looking for, I would crave the affection, I would crave the acceptance of a person, because the best way I can describe it is you don't really feel like you're worthy of it. And so I wasn't particularly interested in another notch on the bed sheet, on the bedpost. It was, I wanted the adoration. I really did.
You wanted the closeness. Yeah.
And when I got that, I'd move on. And it was like filling up my self-esteem bucket, as I've referred to it, which has constantly got a leak in it.
Your mother dies. In the film, I think it's matched with you losing your job, which I don't think did happen at that stage. But your marriage also ends. Your first marriage also ends. Those things culminate with a proper unravelling, if I can put it that way. And you drive to Beachy Head. Tell us what happened.
Rainy Tuesday morning, after a long weekend, in quick succession, my marriage had failed, the children had left, my mother had done what she'd done. And I drove out of my house to the end of the road. Right was to Goldman, left was to somewhere else, and I chose Beachy Head. And I drove all the way down there, and it was a Wuthering Heights sort of scene, really, blowing wind. And I went into a small shop on the cliffs, which is still there, and I ordered a cappuccino. And in front of my eyes on the bar above my head was an appeal to raise £200 for a local charity. And in total, Goldman Sachs largesse, I wrote a cheque for £150, which made up the outstanding. Handed it to this rather bemused girl behind the counter, took my cappuccino, went and sat back down. Drank my cappuccino, walked out towards the cliff edge with an intent, I believe, to get it done. Looking back, I don't know whether I would have got there. And as I walked towards the edge, I suddenly turned around and I saw these two policemen running. And there was a guy ahead of me on the cliff edge, and they sort of half ran past me, and then the girl yelled, "No, him!" And they turned and jumped on me.
The woman in the shop, David, saved your life.
Probably. You don't know for certain, but probably. I mean, who knows? Would I have turned around if I got to the edge? Would I have jumped? I don't know. But I was very down. There's no doubt about that. I spent the afternoon in police station, and where, bizarrely, a clock chimed every 15 minutes outside the window. It was the longest day of my entire life. And during that process, I got so scared about the lack of a future, trying to appeal to two doctors in succession about my sanity, trying to prove to them that I wasn't worthy of sectioning. And I suddenly feared for my future, which makes me think, I was in the cell, I didn't want to go back out to this, I decided that I wanted to move on from this horrible experience. And so I pleaded with these doctors to let me go over the course of the day. And by the end of the day, they did. And I was back at my desk at Goldman the following day, and no one knew. And so I decided to fight back against the faces, frankly. I'm not going to be told what to do, and they're not going to have the rest of my life. It's the way I motivate myself.
You didn't leave that cell clear-eyed and certain on what direction you were heading in. It was more complicated than that. Some of the aspects of your character that you've described remained. I think you'd met Vanessa previously, but then you met Vanessa again and you fall in love and you get married. But this is not a straight line, is it?
No.
Towards a happy ending. Just give us a sense of what happened.
Yeah, I'd met Vanessa before. We'd always seen eye to eye. We got married in 95. In 98 we had a son called Seth, who is 6'6" and looks like Jesus now. And we had another son in 2003. I struggled with the first son, which is depicted in the film.
Yes.
Correctly. I did not warm to the notion at all. I was terrified about doing it all again. I distanced myself from the whole notion of children. My other children were with my divorced other wife. I saw them, but I didn't see them that regularly. You know, they were not my everyday life, put it that way. And the thought of going back to doing that again was
You decided that you weren't capable of being a father.
Yeah, that was what I meant. Sorry, that's exactly what I meant. I didn't want to be.
Your rationale was?
I was scared of it going wrong. I'm scared of them going through something like I'd done. I was scared of not being good enough. I was scared of my personality not working out. And all those things manifested itself in being cold with Seth for the early stages, which upset Vanessa. I didn't do it. I frankly didn't do it deliberately. I just couldn't muster the warmth. I was very standoffish. I sort of left it to her in many respects, and that I think has always created a bit of a void between myself and Seth. We're warmer now, we see each other a lot and much better now. He's 25 now. But I regret that now, I do. But Vanessa's a remarkable person. She tolerated me in the early stages. She understood to a degree what I was going through. And
we're jumping just slightly ahead, if you don't mind me pausing for a second, because again, the film, brutal honesty, you behave very badly in the early days of that marriage, quite aside from the distance that you put between yourself and her and your son. You unravel again, but this time it leads to you. And in the film, you're sat at the kitchen table. I don't know whether that was actually what happened. And you tell Vanessa what happened to you. Can you just tell me about that conversation?
This was probably more of a breaking point in many respects than Beachy Head had been. The one person I never wanted to tell was Vanessa. One person I never really thought I'd ever tell would be her, of all people. Because to her, I was James Bond. I'm still flattered by the way she looks at me. It's still lovely, still remarkable. I still find it right. But she does. And so I didn't want to destroy that vision that she has of me. But finally, through the circumstances that are depicted in the film, you reach a point where you've just got to give it all up a bit. I expected her to leave me. I expected her to walk away and never look at me the same way again. That's what you expect. I know it sounds perhaps irrational to someone who's not gone through something like this, but you do feel...
That's what you've been expecting your entire life.
Yeah, but you do feel revolting. You do feel that you're probably hideous to touch. You do feel that you're scarred or tainted. And how could she possibly look at someone like me again in the same way, knowing that that had happened to me and that I'd done what I'd done to them? How could those images go through her mind and her not think that? That's what I was thinking.
But instead she embraced you.
Yeah. And there's still a part of me, though, deep down inside, that wishes she had the whole illusion without... I still see that as a flaw. I can't help myself. And there's still part of me that wishes she saw me as James Bond, not James Bond with luggage. I know it sounds crazy. But she was just wonderful. And I'll be honest, I think, as I've said to many before, that I don't think I'd be around if it wasn't for her. I don't think my life would be the same if I hadn't met her at that point, and that she stood with me and patiently worked her way through the different layers of this to the point that I'm now a relatively reasonable human being, I think, who dotes on her and tries to listen and tries not to be too root one. But I, you know, without her.
And it was that support that led you to sending that email as part of your fundraising. We haven't even talked about Everest. I'm going to very briefly. On one of your Everest climbs, you decide actually the moment is now right for me to explain why it is, or at least allude to why it is I am raising money for the NSPCC.
That's right.
And you send an email that simply says, I am one of those children.
That's right. Vanessa knew by then, not a couple of years before. And 2007, I sent this email, and I stared at those few lines, at that one line at the bottom of the email that I sent to thousands of people. And I thought, shall I send it? Shall I send it? Shall I send it? And then at 5 o'clock on the dot, I hit the send button and ran, because it was going to go to everybody. I didn't sleep that night.
I was going to say, how did that feel?
It was nerve-wracking. And I walked in the following morning and waited for this reaction. There was nothing. There was nothing from anybody, really, just a few nods and smiles. That's it. The world felt like it's going to end. The great thing was, though, that the fundraising was spectacular. I'd accidentally fundraised a ton of money in 2005 for my first climb. And 2007 hit the ball out of the park as well. And then, just a little bit of a jump to 2010, the charity asked me, without knowing any details, the charity asked me to tell my story. They had not read my manuscript, which I'd written in 2007. They just said, would you be prepared to tell your story? And I went, yeah.
And each time that you tell the story, as you've done so generously with us today, how does it feel? Because you know, early in our conversation, you said those faces are still with you.
When I give these speeches, I end up inheriting quite a few contacts. I give a function, 500-700 people give my speech. There's a good 20 people who come up to me with similar stories who haven't told anybody. But they not all, but some get in contact, and I end up trying to do my best to help and talk through their problems with them. But it's very difficult to be a help to these people. It's very difficult to articulate what works for me and what doesn't work for me. And trying to get that across to them is a complicated thing.
Your message is not, you must do as I did, or rather, you must do as I didn't do for such a long period of my life. You must talk about this. You must tell someone. Or is it a more complicated message?
I try and give people a message that I'm generally thanked for telling my story in these situations, because I couldn't, is their quote generally. And then I say to people, you've got to really come to terms with, you will live with the faces in your mind, you will live with the memories. And there comes a point where you can't, and this was forced upon me as I've described, I mean, I'm not a genius in this respect. There comes a point, I realise, where no one really cares outside. You've got to look after yourself. You can cry all day if you want to. You can whinge all day, you can moan, you can keep going to therapy. But there does come a point where you've got to be brutally honest with yourself and say, I'm going to live with this, I'm going to deal with it, I'm not going to let it beat me, I'm not going to let them or he or she or whatever it was beat me. That's the critical element. If you do, you're on a constant spiral. And so the advice I try and give to these people, and some people I appear on Zooms in front of me crying their eyes out, is you've got to make the decision for it not to hurt you anymore. It's your call. Your call. And don't think that the world is going to care too much about you. They're not going to be able to help you. And I mean this. I went on this big meeting the other day for all health and medical professionals with the NSBC. There were 500 people on this call. And I think I surprised them by saying, you shouldn't indulge the people who are abused too much. You should try and give them the space to tell their story, and then the encouragement to stand up on their own. Because if you do indulge it too much, you increase the spiral down.
I think in the backdrop to what you've just said, it's important that people understand what the statistics are, because I know that's what drives you in these conversations, on those Zoom calls, in the speeches that you give, podcasts that you generously sit on. Is that 1 in 20 children in this country will have suffered some form of sexual abuse, and 1 in 3 of those will never talk about it, as you didn't for so long. And that's the cycle really that you're trying to break, isn't it?
Absolutely. And those statistics are as good as they're going to get, but I suspect it's much higher.
Yeah. David, we have glossed over, somehow, I don't know, on a podcast called Crisis What Crisis, 5 ascents of Mount Everest. We could almost do a separate podcast. Maybe we should, because there's plenty of crisis in those climbs. One in particular, when you thought you were going to die. Just tell us briefly about that, if you don't mind. It feels like a very awkward kind of insertion into this story. But,
I know.
But I think the question actually that I've got, that I want to hear that story quickly, but also, what's driving you? This isn't a charity bike ride. You're deciding, with no mountaineering experience, as I understand it, the first time you did it, and it's got to be Everest, and then 5 times.
Yeah, it's still that Route 1 mentality.
Yeah.
Why do a smaller mountain mentality? I didn't see any point. I needed to gain traction. It needed to be high profile, and I was flabbergasted by how much money I raised. I raised $250 the first time, second time $300 grand, and it was like, wow. And I really didn't expect that. I expected 20,000, really did. And so I felt compelled to keep going back. But the death story was, we were going through the icefall. I was with 5 or 6 guide friends, because I'd done it so many times. I was sort of one of the guides in a peculiar way. And I had Jimi Hendrix in one ear and wearing a helmet for the very first time. And the icefall's a horrible place. And it was dawn, and I suddenly heard this roar. And I looked up, and a cornice had broken off above my head. Vast. And it was coming down towards me. And I tried to take 2 steps in thigh-deep snow. Tried to run, instinct. Realised I couldn't. Dived on the deck, put my head behind a rock, a lump of ice actually. And it cannoned into me. And it wasn't really snow, it was more ice that hammered into me. And a piece smashed into the top of my helmet, cracked the helmet. First time ever I'd worn a helmet. How about that for lucky? Should have bought a lottery ticket. Something cracked in my middle of my back. My shoulder came out, my right shoulder was wrenched out of joint as I twisted, and I felt a blow in my lower leg. And the blow in my lower leg was the most painful of the 4 I've just mentioned by a long way. And as I'm under the snow, buried, I was very scared. And believe me, you don't know you're scared until you find that moment. You think you've been scared, you haven't. That's scary. And I was screaming like a baby. And underneath the snow, I remember thinking 3 things. One, your past life really does flash in front of your eyes. It does. It's a peculiar sensation, like a collage. The second thing is, I've broken my leg. The Queen's going to be really pissed because I won't get the flag up there. And the third thing was, I don't want to die. And that was the first time in my life I really had been confronted with, I want to live. And I'd chosen. And I pushed my left arm down. I was only covered by a foot or 2, although I didn't know.
Right.
I stood up, and there's a great picture of me coming out of the snow. And we got there in 3 days, and down in 1. And I got the flag up there first. We were the first 2 people on the summit.
I'm glad I asked you to tell that story, because the image actually that I'd like to leave our listeners and viewers is of you stood at the top of the world, carrying a Union Jack for Her Majesty the Queen, with a smile on your face.
I'll send you the picture.
Please do, because if that doesn't epitomise and capture your unbelievable strength of character, your, and I know you won't like me using this word, David, but your courage and your bravery, in climbing that mountain again and raising the money that you did, but frankly for the unbelievable story that you shared with us today. I mean, it's just to say it's inspiring is an understatement, and thank you sincerely for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this conversation with David, then please do leave us a review, and if you found it helpful or even inspiring, we'd be delighted if you would recommend us to your friends. You can watch the full episodes on YouTube, follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and if you hit subscribe, you'll find loads more crisis conversations. As always, full transcripts are available on our website along with links. Just head to crisiswhatcrisis.com. And thanks so much for listening.